Hello, today I'm going to be talking to you about the language and changing dynamics of SEND provision. My name is James Waller. I am a trustee of Equals, a national non-for-profit organisation that supports the education of children and young people with learning difficulties. Alongside roles with a number of national bodies, I am also the head teacher of Sunningdale School, a school for children with severe, profound and multiple learning difficulties, including autism, in Sunderland, Tyne and Wear. In three short sections that make up this session, what I'm going to try and do is cover something that is a very, very broad subject. In the first section, what I'm going to do is just set out the kind of standard language that we use when we're describing special educational needs and disabilities, including what we mean by learning difficulties and learning disabilities. In the second section, what I'm going to address are current trends nationally around different types of learning difficulty and disability and what that means for us day in, day out in our classrooms. This will also include how we support ECTs to reflect on and cope with the changing dynamics that are happening regarding special educational needs and disabilities in their own classrooms as well. In the third section, what I'm going to be talking about is the language of SEND. So we're going to look at how we have described different difficulties and disabilities in the previous two sections, but also reflect on the power of using positive non-deficit language, what that means for us, what that means for the learners we teach, and how we can support ECTs to engage in that dialogue about non-deficit language and how that will help them better understand the children and young people that they teach. So in this first section, what we're going to do is just focus on the standard language used when talking about special educational needs and disabilities. Now, if we dive straight into the Children and Families Act and look at two terms that are often used interchangeably, special educational needs and special educational needs and disabilities, you can immediately see where some of the complexities around the language that we use start to come from. So we have here a definition of special educational needs that within the definition itself starts to describe and talk about a learning difficulty or disability. So it talks about disability even within the context of special educational needs as a definition. So what probably provides a little more clarity here is the Equality Act. So the first definition here you can see reflects the previous slide from the Children and Family Act and says that a child has special educational needs if they have much greater difficulty learning something than most others of the same age, or a disability that makes it difficult for them to use the facilities that others of the same age use in mainstream schools or educational settings. What it goes on to describe is that a child has special educational needs and disabilities if they have either or both of the above, but also a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term negative effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So to put this in more straightforward terms, what we're really talking about is that a special educational need focuses on learning difficulties and or disabilities that require additional support to access education. Special educational needs and disabilities encompass SEN and other disabilities, even if they don't directly impact learning. So when we consider disabilities in this context, we might be thinking about things like physical disabilities, certain types of sensory impairment, or even conditions such as epilepsy, for example. These would be disabilities, but would also be considered special educational needs at the point at which they were preventing effective access to learning or provision in typical mainstream education. So as we continue to kind of wade our way through this jungle of jargon, as it were, we're going to look at two other terms that are often used interchangeably. So where we're going to consider the difference between a learning difficulty and a learning disability. What we really want to think about when we're looking at these two terms is that a learning disability impacts a person's general intellectual ability. So will be widespread in its impact. When we're considering a learning difficulty, we're usually talking about something that doesn't affect general intellect and has a very specific impact on a type of learning. So in considering that specific impact, it's really important that we acknowledge there are multiple different types of learning difficulty. It's also possible for learning difficulties to co-occur, so an individual may have multiple learning difficulties. They may also have a learning disability and a learning difficulty. In the continuum of learning difficulties, we are going to briefly consider specific learning difficulties and then also look at moderate, severe, profound, and multiple learning difficulties. When we're considering language around specific learning difficulties such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and dyspraxia, you will have absolutely encountered and taught pupils in your classrooms that experience these difficulties. One important thing to highlight is that specific learning difficulties can co-occur with one another. So you can have pupils that have multiple specific learning difficulties, and you can also have pupils that have specific learning difficulties co-occurring with other impairments and disabilities. So impairments such as ADHD, for example. What's interesting with this continuum of learning difficulty is that in England and the UK, we tend to use the terms moderate learning difficulty, severe learning difficulty, and profound and multiple learning difficulty to describe a kind of gradient or continuum of complexity of need and complexity of difficulty when we're describing learning difficulties. However, in the UK, these are not really clearly defined, and we're one of the only countries in the world that uses the term difficulty rather than disability. So what I'm going to do now is just describe learning disabilities, and what I will do is articulate some of the differences or unique characteristics of a moderate learning disability, a severe learning disability, and a profound and multiple learning disability in order to provide some insight as to the levels of impairment and difficulty that we might be trying to describe when we use these terms. If we look at these definitions of a learning disability from the Department of Health and Social Care, supported by some information from the National Institute of Care and Excellence, we can see that they define a learning disability as a reduced intellectual ability. So it's a significantly reduced ability to understand new or complex information, to learn new skills, so impaired intelligence, with a reduced ability to cope independently, so impaired social functioning, which started before adulthood. What NICE point out, that's the National Institute of Care and Excellence, is that internationally at least the term intellectual disability is being used more frequently now than learning disability. So what that definition of learning disability from the Department of Health and Social Care does for us is really set out the three core criteria that help define a learning disability. And that would be lower intellectual ability, significant impairment of social or adaptive functioning, and onset during childhood. What we're going to do now is briefly look at the continuum of learning disability by considering mild, moderate, severe, and profound and multiple learning disabilities. Now, what you've got on the slide in front of you is a significant volume of information. So I'm just going to leave it up there for a while in order to give you an opportunity to digest it. But what you're actually looking at is the National Institute for Care and Excellence's summary of the World Health Organization's descriptions of different level of learning disability. You can see that it moves through the continuum from mild learning disability through to profound and multiple learning disability, and it presents the information as an approximate IQ range that might be associated with each level of learning disability, the types of skills and impairments that might form the presentation of those levels of learning disability, and then some of the adaptations or support that might be required for somebody with that level of learning disability to engage in everyday life. This is really useful to us as educators because it gives an indication of some of the levels of adaptation that might be required for somebody with that level of learning disability to effectively access education. If you look at somebody with a mild learning disability or the description of somebody with a mild learning disability, you can see that they probably require relatively minor adaptation and differentiation in order really just to access and acquire the most complex academic concepts. For somebody with a severe learning disability, though, for example, you're talking about a far greater level of adaptation. This will be somebody learning at far earlier developmental levels, and requiring a curriculum and approaches that will support them in developing skills around independence, self-care, communication, social skills, and very early literacy and numeracy. This might also include adaptations required because of motor and sensory impairments. For an individual with profound and multiple learning disabilities, you'd be talking about a far greater level of adaptation. This would be to every aspect of their environment, the physical environment, the approaches used with them, and the levels of support. These would be individuals learning at the very earliest developmental levels in terms of their communication, cognition, and social skills, and they would require curricula that also supports their sensory and therapeutic needs, which might also include complex medical needs. So I've just got this slide up there really just as an overview really, or a reminder of a summary of what we've been talking about. But you probably recognize a lot of the language that we've been using so far in this slightly longer first section as being reflected in the school census categories. Now, I've just put this up there because really this is the official language. These are the official labels that we are given to describe our cohorts of children with special educational needs and disabilities in our schools. And I just want you to very briefly reflect, or certainly as we go into the discussion points, as to how useful this information is or how useful these descriptions are in us actually understanding the needs and how to meet the needs of those children with special educational needs and disabilities that we have in our classrooms and we have in our schools. So in our first discussion points, I just want you to reflect on some of the descriptions and language that we've been looking at so far and think about how useful they are in actually describing the special educational needs of the pupils that we teach. Also, how useful are they in helping us to develop an understanding of what a child can do and what adaptations we might need to make for a child to effectively access education. So in this second section of the session, we're just going to start to reflect on the current trends and the changing dynamics of SEND provision nationally and what that might mean for us in our classrooms. I shared this slide in the previous section of the session, and as you can see, it just sets out the labels and categories used by the school census each year to collect information about the numbers of pupils with special educational needs in our schools. On the next slide, I'm just going to share an overview of some of the headlines from the most recent data capture. Census information relating to special educational needs was most recently published in June 2025. And you can see from some of these headlines here on the slide that it reports a significant increase of pupils being described as having special educational needs. Over 1.7 million pupils in England were identified with special educational needs in June. And this is an increase of about 94,000 pupils, so 5.6% increase since 2024. As you can see from some of this information, the most common type of need for those with an education, health and care plan was autistic spectrum disorder. And for those being reported as receiving SEN support, it was speech, language and communication needs. On this slide is some of the information that sits behind those headlines. There's a lot of information on the slide, so I'm going to leave it up for a little while to allow you to take some of this in. But I would like to really draw your attention to autistic spectrum disorder, and then towards the bottom of the table, social, emotional, and mental health and speech, language, and communication needs. What's interesting is looking back to 2024 and seeing that there were quite significant increases in the number of children being reported as having those types of special educational need, roughly in the region of about 30,000 pupils for each of those categories. If we go back a little further and look all the way back to 2021, and we compare that to 2025, we can see that those increases are really significant. Somewhere in the region of 100,000 additional pupils being reported with those needs and 110,000 pupils in the case of social, emotional, and mental health needs. What I would like to do is just very quickly draw your attention to some of the other categories as a contrast to this. You can see that, for example, with severe learning difficulty, there's no real increases being reported. With multisensory impairment, there's no real increases being reported. And with moderate learning difficulty, we're actually reporting a small decrease year on year. I would just like to look a little more closely at the trends illustrated on the previous slide. I want us to think about how accurate they are and how useful they are in helping us to understand the specific needs of the children that we teach in our classrooms. One of the things that was really interesting is that there is no year-on-year increase being reported in the number of children with multisensory impairments. This seems really unlikely within the context of an increasing population of children with special educational needs. But what I'd like you to think about is that where a child has a multisensory impairment or any sensory impairment and experiences sensory overload, how does that present? What does that look like in our classrooms? And then how do we record and report that? How useful is that information in us understanding the specific adaptations that would be required to support that child's access to effective education? We need to really reflect on how the language and labels we use actually support us in understanding the specific needs of the children and young people that we teach. What does it tell us about the adaptations and support that they're going to require? Something that is being reported in specialist settings for children with severe and profound learning difficulties is an anecdotal increase in the number of children being described as having complex learning difficulties. These are children that will have very little language, they will communicate non-verbally, their communications will generally be proto-imperative, and they'll have very fleeting engagement while being developmentally at very early levels of cognition and communication. In terms of census information and the types of labels we use, it's really likely that these children are being reported as having either severe learning difficulties or under the category of ASD if they have an autism diagnosis. The difficulty is that this doesn't really tell us anything about the specific needs of the child and the very specific adaptations and strategies that are required to meet their needs. So it's just something to reflect on about what data and labels really tells us about the needs of the children in our settings and provisions. So regardless of whether we have the correct labels in place or they're accurate enough in describing the needs that we're experiencing, there is a demonstrable increase in special educational needs and disabilities being reported across all of our schools nationally. This has been recognised by the government and they're clearly committed to addressing this problem and increasing the levels of inclusivity in mainstream schools specifically, but also in partnership with specialist provisions and an increase in the number of specially resourced provisions that are attached to mainstream schools in order to support that increased need. Now we know that the reforms are due to be published early in the 2025-2026 academic year. And what's going to be key is supporting ECTs in their understanding of what those reforms mean for them, their understanding of what their role would look like in terms of supporting children with special educational needs and disabilities, and what for your specific setting that relationship with specialist provisions or enhanced resource provisions or bases within the school or within the trust is going to look like for the ECT. In terms of the discussion points for this section, I just want you to reflect on that complexity shift in pupils with SEND for your own school or trust, and then thinking about how you're tailoring the support for the ECTs in your school and trust based on the needs of those pupils. As a secondary reflection or discussion point, I just want you to think about how you identify and then support ECTs to engage in those collaborative partnerships with other types of school and provision around you. So in this third and final section, we're just going to look at the language of SEND, including how we use deficit and non-deficit language, and explore some of the key principles of positive language and the impact that has on the children and young people we teach and the way in which we understand their special educational needs. So in this context, when we start to think about the language of SEND, I want you to just consider the deficit language that we use around special educational needs and disabilities and the way in which it focuses on what a child can't do. What we want to reflect on is how we use positive affirmative language to emphasize what a child can do, what their learning differences are, and what their strengths and potential looks like. At this stage, I would like us to just briefly reflect back on the language that was used in the first two sections of this session. I want you to think about the definitions, labels, and descriptions that were used in section 1 and the labels and descriptions that were used to describe the data and statistics in section 2. What did they tell us about the characteristics of learning of the children and young people that we're trying to teach with special educational needs and disabilities? And how was that language presented? Was that deficit language or was that non-deficit affirmative language? Document using inclusive language in education produced by the University College London sets out the key principles of positive language. It suggests using person-first language. That is where you describe an individual that has a special educational need rather than describing the individual as a special educational need. It's very common to hear people say, we have X amount of severe learning difficulties. In reality, what you have is X amount of pupils with severe learning difficulties. You also want to try and focus on strengths. That is about describing what the person can do. So in terms of something like engagement, what we want to talk about is how they engage with learning, how they engage with their environment, not what they don't do. If we do this within the context of an individual's needs, because every individual is an individual and their special educational needs and disabilities will present differently and present uniquely for them. If we focus on their strengths and describe that in the context of the individual, what that will help us do is to remain in the realm of using respectful and inclusive language. It'll avoid us being judgmental in how we describe the needs of the person, and it will help us avoid using deficit language. So in trying to avoid using deficit language, we want to be mindful of the power that language can have. We want to think about the terms that we use and whether they are terms that empower or disempower people. Something that we also want to try and avoid is patronizing language. A person isn't brave or inspirational because of their disability. It might be that they are brave and inspirational, but it's more than likely going to be in spite of their disability rather than because of it. So why is this so important? Well, UCL set out some of the outcomes that we get from using positive non-deficit language. It promotes inclusivity. It fosters a sense of belonging. It helps to reduce stigma amongst children in their communities across schools. A language that focuses on the strengths of the individual and describes the presentation of the individual's special educational need helps to empower the child. It talks about what they can do. It supports their development of self-esteem and confidence. And what this does for us actually as educators is support us in better understanding the adaptations and support that we need to put in place to more effectively meet the needs of a child in a classroom, in a lesson, in a particular curriculum area, and helps us to remove those barriers to learning for individual children. So in terms of taking that deficit language and trying to flip that into positive language, I've got a couple of examples here on the screen, but one that I'm going to focus on is where it says he is disruptive. What's really interesting about that is it describes the outcome of the child's presentation. It describes the thing that has happened rather than the child themselves and the presentation of their special educational need. And that's what we want to focus on, is describing them as an individual, not the outcome that that has, because that will often lead us into using deficit language. So in terms of trying to provide some level of support, framework, or scaffolding for our ECTs to use positive non-deficit language, there are some tools and documents available to us, one of which is the SEND Code of Practice. The SEND Code of Practice sets out 4 broad areas of need that provide a framework to describe a child's special educational needs in the holistic sense, to describe them as an individual and how their needs present within each of those areas. It provides a framework that's quite straightforward to start describing what a child can do in terms of their cognition and learning, what a child can do in terms of their communication and interaction. So, therefore, starts to scaffold that type of thinking and language around describing the child as an individual, describing their strengths rather than what they can't do and what they're not able to access. And then a final thought before we move into our discussion points would just be for everybody to reflect on how often do you break down the needs of the young people you work with SEND into their actual learner characteristics. So, how do they present as a learner? What does their communication look like? What is the actual presentation of their learning difficulty or disability? What's their ability to engage? What do their developmental levels tell them or tell us about how they access different areas of the curriculum? What does their ability to play look like? What are their social skills like? What is their understanding of emotional development? How well do they tolerate uncertainty and those kinds of things? How often do we break down the characteristics of learners like this in a way so that we better understand the individual needs of individual children? So, our final discussion point of the session is really to just reflect on the language used throughout the earlier sections. How useful was that language in actually defining and helping us to understand the special educational needs of the pupils we teach? Does that language describe pupils in a positive, non deficit way, or is it predominantly using deficit language? Secondarily, I'd like you to think about how are you going to support the ECTs that you mentor to think about their pupils this way? How are you going to support them to use positive language and language that more effectively helps them to understand the needs of the children they teach and the kinds of support and adaptations that they're going to have to put in place?